which is a leading polling and research firm. For those who know politics, you may know his name. He is often in the news and was more so following his firm's accurate forecast on the popular vote in the last election, and also most recently with his timely research on how Canadians are responding and coping with COVID-19. So in addition to that, you also may know David from his work with us here at Trucking HR Canada. We've had the pleasure of working with him over the past few years. And in 2018, 2019, we did some extensive research into young people's perceptions of the trucking and logistics industry. Knowing our challenges in reaching young people, we sought to learn more about what they thought of our industry and how we can better reach them. And that research informed our Millennials Have Drive 2 report, as well as other programming that we do here at Trucking HR. So today, as we're experiencing unprecedented change and circumstances with COVID-19, we again sought to learn if COVID-19 has impacted perceptions of our industry. So David is going to share those insights and some of those findings with us today, as well as other research that David has conducted regularly on how Canadians generally are coping with the pandemic. So as everyone joins in, again, we kindly ask you keep your cameras off, microphones are muted. We will have time for questions at the end, and we will manage it through the chat on the right side. We'll do our best to address all of your questions. So on that note, David, thank you so much for joining us today, and I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Angela. And I've shared my screen. Angela, can you see that? Okay. Well, welcome everybody. I see a lot of friendly names on the list here, so hope everyone is doing well. It's a pleasure to be back. As Angela said, my team and I have been spending a lot of the last 10 weeks, like everyone else, getting accustomed to the new world we live in and how it's affected our work life and our family life and so on. And from a professional perspective, I've become, to some extent, obsessed with trying to understand how what we're going through today is going to impact our lives and the broader economy going forward. And so what I wanted to do today is take you through two pieces of data. One is our ongoing tracking of how Canadians are responding to the pandemic, looking at some questions that we've been asking basically since mid-March when the lockdown in most provinces really began. And then to go into some original research that we did in partnership with Trucking HR Canada that looks at how Canadians feel about the trucking sector and companies, and looking at trucking and the broader logistics sector as a career choice, and try to understanding what we can from the survey research that we did, what impact all of this is having, and where the sector is going forward, and what the future might look like. So to get into really where we are now, I think one of the ways that has helped me understand the crisis is to think about it in a set of stages or phases. And what I've come up with here is a framework through the lens of the public opinion research that we've done and through the lens of the average Canadian. And so not necessarily from a business cycle perspective, not necessarily from an employee's perspective, but more from the average person. I now think we're about to start phase 3. So for the last few weeks, I think we were solidly in the second phase of this crisis. The first phase started in mid-March, almost 10 weeks ago, when we were all sort of shocked by the speed at which we were told to sort of distance ourselves, change our lifestyle, change the way we work. You know, for many Canadians, they saw their jobs basically disappear. And really, though, that first stage was us reacting and getting things in order. I think we're now in phase 2, which is much more about coping and waiting to see as the economy starts to open, as our lives are allowed to return more to as they were, and in some provinces sooner rather than later, depending on where you live across the country. But phase 3 to me is where we're about to start. And that's what I call the research phase. And it's an important one because it's the phase in which consumers and workers and citizens, voters, however you want to classify them, start to look at this world in a way that's different than in the past, because we don't have a vaccine yet. We don't have a treatment for coronavirus or COVID-19. And so these next few weeks or months or years, hopefully not, are going to be about mitigating the risk of contracting the virus at the same time as trying to get back to life as we want it. And for some of us, how it used to be, for some of us, maybe how it will be going forward. And we won't really hit phase 4, I think, until that vaccine is found. Now, when I look at the big...
David,
yes.
it's Angela, we can't see your screen. Are you sharing your slides?
I should be. Let me try again.
Yeah, sure.
Sorry about that. Thanks for letting me know. How about now?
Yeah. Yes, now we see it, David.
All right. Sorry about that. The red box means it's in. Okay. So here's the phases. And so I think when I step back and I look at some of the big trends that we have been monitoring, at the very least, when we think about what's going to change in the new world that comes after this pandemic, which is unlike anything any of us have ever experienced in terms of both its scale, its speed, and the length at which it has gone on, I do think things that we were looking at before the pandemic began will likely accelerate. So we are going to see, I think, a continued shift towards a much more digital first experience for many people. As we had shown, in some of the work we did with Angela and her team, as well as other stuff on generational differences, younger Canadians were kind of ahead of everybody else when it came to how they worked and how they interacted with organizations, and the role that technology, and particularly digital technology, played in their lives. I think more of us now are at that stage. So digital first is something that is going to be much more important. I think, depending on what kind of sector you work in, if you're an office based employee versus one that's out in the field, much more flexible work arrangements are going to probably be the norm. We were seeing that moving in that direction anyways, but for many employers, I think, there's been some recognition that, your team can be as productive having work from home. And so I suspect that will be part of the experience going forward. Maybe not 100% work from home, but some kind of flexible arrangement that allows you to work from home. But perhaps more important to so many sectors of the economy is a trend we had seen earlier, which is a much more home-based experience. So more of our time spent at home, which is really a return in a way. And if you're in a sector like food service, mass entertainment like concerts or movies, if you're in hospitality or tourism, we have over the last 10 weeks been forced to stay home and replace all of the things we loved to do before with other things that are much more digital, but also can be done at home. And so for me, understanding how consumer trends are going to continue is to recognize that even when we feel completely comfortable exiting our homes and being around lots of people again, many of us may not be inclined to do it, not because we don't want to, but because we found other interests or we've developed new habits. And the research on new habit formation says, anywhere between 20 and 60 days, it can take us to develop new habits. We are getting close to even the higher end of that in terms of what's going to come out of this. And so the two questions that I keep coming to are what's that new normal going to be, and what's the right bet to make as leaders of your organizations as you think about how to plan for the future and how we look ahead and say, okay, how do we rebuild, recover? How do we take advantage of new opportunities? How do we prevent threats and risks from overtaking us? I think understanding where people come from and the role that both from an employee perspective as well as from a consumer perspective, I think is important. And so if we look at then how Canadians broadly are feeling about all of this, what's been very clear is that things have changed from week to week. And we've seen an evolution in terms of how people were 10 weeks ago and how they are today. But the overall story is still one in which many Canadians remain quite concerned. And so this is the tracking of the percentage of people who say they are extremely worried or worried a lot about the coronavirus or COVID-19 situation today. And so it's a measure of that most intense group who report being worried. You can see it increased very quickly from February to March. It then kind of flatlined a little bit. And what we're seeing is a softening of that most worried number. In our most recent survey done this week, it's down to 29%, but that's still high. So that's basically 3 out of 10 Canadians saying they are still extremely worried or worried a lot about this pandemic. And the drivers about what's causing that worry are starting to shift too, which I'll speak to in a moment. But another measure we often look at is, are you getting more worried or less worried about this pandemic? And you can see that we've basically been, for almost a month now, at a point where about equal numbers of people say they are getting more worried over time about this pandemic as opposed to less worried. Whereas back in March and April, early April and sort of late March, you saw far more people saying I'm getting more worried. So as these lines get together, and I think as the green one overpasses the red, we're going to be getting into that new phase where more and more people are going to feel comfortable doing the things that they were doing before, and that intensity of all of this starts to level a little bit. But one of the new things we've noticed more recently, though, is a deep and broad concern about the risk of a second spike in infections. And so as we debate, how fast to reopen the economy, as there's discussions around, how are we going to mitigate the risk that still exists, almost 7 out of 10 Canadians continue to say, I'm at least really or somewhat worried about this second spike. And so in some way, whether that's sending their kids back to school, where we've seen in Quebec, I'm in Ottawa right now, across the river, schools opened last week and very few students showed up because parents were hesitant to send their kids back to school. That if you open your workplace and you just say it's return to normal, nothing's really changed, that's back to what it was, March 15th, you may not find a lot of employees feel comfortable doing that. So there is this worry both of contracting the virus myself, there's a worry about somebody I love still getting this virus, and together the fear of this repeating itself, weeks from now. When we ask people how likely is it that you or somebody will contract this virus, what's important here is that first, a majority of Canadians think it's likely that that's going to happen, and that's been that way now pretty much since the lockdown and the real scare of this pandemic hit Canada in mid-March. Week to week, we've seen slight increases or decreases, but the overall story is most people still believe that it's likely that they could contract this virus at some point. And that's likely going to continue until we either have a vaccine or a treatment or some kind of testing or tracing regime that makes us confident that, that virus is not anywhere near us. The risk of it is still there. And I always remind people that for an intense period of a few days early on in this crisis, we were bombarded with stories and messages about how dangerous this virus was. And so that is still in our heads. And it's going to be hard to get people to feel comfortable knowing that that virus is still out there. And while it's maybe the spread is under control, we flattened the curve, we're returning back to normal, it's still there and there's still some risk that I might get it. And that extended time period and when I'm going to get back to normal is something we've seen evolve over time. So this is the percentage of Canadians who say it will take 6 months or more at the time we did the survey to get back to life more or less as before. And you can see it's been a steady increase week over week in the percentage of people who think it's going to be a long-term impact to their lives. Early on, when this first started, only 1 out of 5 Canadians thought, in 6 months or more, is my life going to be disrupted? Most people felt it was going to be a much shorter term disruption. Half of us now believe this is a longer term thing, and life as we know it won't really get back to normal for quite some time. And that's affecting, again, how people perceive this challenge. The last point around broad attitudes is we did see a big shift. This is the percentage of Canadians who say that the worst is still to come. And we're measuring this because it gives us a sense of confidence that people are going to have to, again, get back to doing the things that they're doing, giving governments license to open up the economy more quickly. And you can see that we saw a big shift in April, but that number really hasn't changed since then, where we still have about 4 out of 10 Canadians who say the worst is still to come. Only a small minority say the worst is behind us, and everybody else, about 40%, say, I'm not sure what stage of this crisis we're in, but I'm not confident that it's going to get worse, but I'm not necessarily confident that it's the worst is behind us either. So the overall picture is dampening down of sort of the deepest, scariest concern, but still a lot of consumers, a lot of Canadians out there feeling quite concerned about this, particularly if you're older, particularly if you're female, and if you've got, for example, a chronic illness, you're extra sensitive about the risk that's involved still in going outside of your home and interacting with people. Now, obviously, this has been a health crisis for much of the 10 weeks that we've lived through it, but early on, it quickly also became an economic crisis. And we see the numbers of Canadians who have been laid off or furloughed or temporarily released from their work, the numbers of people who've applied for government assistance, the fact the government's extending that assistance to August is an indicator of just how big the economic impact has been. When we ask Canadians, how has this pandemic affected your household income? What we see is really two Canadas in some way. One in which about 40% say that their household income has decreased. In the early days of this, the decrease was much more acute because the short-term financial aid from government hadn't yet come in. So the initial shock was quite real. People felt when they were laid off or they lost numbers of hours of work that income wasn't going to come. Since governments replaced some of that income, people have felt a little less anxious, but it's still real. And then you've got about half the country that it has had no real impact yet. And in fact, 1 out of 4 say their income's actually gone up as a result of the pandemic. And that might include some people who make a little bit more off government assistance. But generally speaking, you've got these two Canadas right now where you're starting to see more and more stories. We see some evidence of in our data. Many households actually have pulled their spending back significantly. If you've had children in childcare, well, you're saving maybe $2,000 a month for 2 months now. There's going to be some who are going to be able to save and pay off debt, and we see lots of evidence that that's happening. And so a very different picture. But the long-term concern is there. You can see almost half of Canadians say they're really or somewhat worried about long-term financial concerns. Another colleague of mine in the industry released some numbers today that showed Canadians are almost as likely to cite the economy as their top concern as the pandemic. So the economy is slowly creeping up as a broader concern for people as they reflect on the long-term impact that this will have, not just on people's income, on the the labor market, but also on retirement security, housing prices, interest rates, and so on. And you can sort of talk about the extension of this beyond. But as of early May, 1 out of 5 Canadians still say to us that they are worried their job will disappear. And so it underscores the level of insecurity, the level of vulnerability that so many Canadians right now are feeling. And I've never seen a number this high. And so as much as government assistance is kind of backstopped people today, they do know that it can't go on forever. And there's a growing concern about the level of fiscal stimulus that the government has already put into bridging the crisis and whether that's sustainable in the long term and what its impact is going to be on them if they rely on it today. And if they don't rely on it, what the financial impact will be for governments down the line. Now, speaking of governments, very briefly, one of the things that we have seen, though, is a real rallying around the flag when it comes to how Canadians are feeling about their governments at the federal, provincial, and municipal level. One of the, I guess, contradictory or ironic findings is that more Canadians today say they believe the country's headed in the right direction than they did before the crisis started. So despite most people thinking we're in a deep recession or a depression, despite people feeling worried about the state of international relations and the role that China's playing and Trump and all of that, they still look at our own country and say, well, it seems that our governments are doing a good job. Seems like our institutions held up. Our financial system is holding up. That's giving people, I think, a little bit more confidence that the system is working. At least it's working here. And in some ways, we can't help but look to what's going on in the United States and say, I'm happy that I'm Canadian right now and not having to face some of the challenges that some states in the U.S. are facing with with the spread of the virus there. So that's an indication that people are feeling quite positive. When we ask people to reflect on the federal government's performance around the pandemic, these are sky high numbers. This is the percent who say they're doing well or as well as can be expected. It wasn't long ago that coming out of the federal election that this government was seeing, approval ratings in the high 30s. Now they're getting approval ratings in the 60s. And when you include those who are just more or less happy, you get up to 80%. It's a really impressive number. Early in April, we asked people, to reflect on the federal emergency aid package. At the time, only 3% of Canadians felt that the government had done too much to respond to the pandemic. In fact, 1 out of 5 felt they had not done enough. Since we tested this, the government has come out with more programs for different, for seniors, for students, for larger businesses, for extending CERB until August, and spending, $150 to $160 billion in the meantime. There's very little, despite people being worried about that level of spending, there's no real desire to see it pulled back at this point. And I think it's partly and largely, in fact, due to the vulnerability that people are feeling. Provincially, where I have large enough sample sizes, you see the same story, whether you're in Quebec or Ontario or British Columbia or Alberta, Manitoba. High praise, generally speaking, for the performance that governments have had on this. Again, numbers I have not seen. Where I live in Ontario, our Premier Doug Ford had negatives in the high 60s in February. Today he's got positives in the 80s. And so, this has fundamentally reshaped people's views of these leaders because they had to respond to this crisis. But it doesn't mean it's going to last, or it's going to last a long time. So we'll see as we move from the response and reaction phase of this crisis from a political lens to one that is more about rebuilding and recovery, the politics will come back in because choices will start to have to be made. And that's, I think, where we'll start to see some of these numbers come back down to earth a little bit, and us seeing the usual divides that we see across the country. But I think this goodwill will continue, certainly going forward. Now, one of the other things we're tracking closely, and I can't share all the data because we got a lot of it, but just to give you a flavor of how our life is going to change, particularly in this moment where we don't have a vaccine and people are going to start venturing out. I know in some provinces, my father-in-law lives in Alberta. He got a haircut yesterday. We can't do that quite yet in Ontario, but we now have parks opening up, and we have, depending on where you live in the country, you are now able to start doing more and more things that you were doing before. But what's clear is how we do those things. The experience itself is going to be very different. But one way that we are certainly seeing an impact is the fear of the virus is impacting our intended behavior. We've done research for the live music sector. We're doing research for tourism and travel. There's a clear sense that people are constraining their choices. They're thinking about different choices when it comes to, for example, whether to go on a summer vacation, what that summer vacation might look like, their comfort level going to a restaurant or riding public transit or going back to work. All of those things are being impacted primarily still about the fear of this virus. So as an example, when we ask people, how comfortable, what's your comfort level doing the following things, assuming there's no vaccine yet, but you're allowed to do it? And to me, it's that gap that's so interesting and so important. It's, I can do something, but am I comfortable doing it? Is that area that businesses, employers, organizations that interact with the public are going to have to deal with, because just because I can do something doesn't mean I will. And you can see the level of trepidation on anything that I describe as kind of like mass entertainment. So going to a movie theater, going to a music festival, even going to a pub or a bar to watch live music. You've got half of people saying they don't feel comfortable at all doing it. Even those who regularly do these kinds of activities are saying, I'm not going to be completely comfortable right away. Taking a kid to a playground, even 35% say they're not comfortable doing it. So all of these behaviors that, in March 10th, we may not have believed to be risky, now appear risky to a lot of people. And getting comfortable again will take some time. I'm describing it likely as a period of dipping our toes in the water before jumping in. But I think as people get back to it, and hopefully we don't see another spike in infections, that's going to cause kind of a ripple effect that gets people fairly quickly getting back to doing things. I couldn't help but see the number of people out at garden centers this past weekend as an indication of the desire to get out and buy plants and start your gardening now that the weather's getting so much good across the country. But on the other hand, the way that people were shopping, the hesitancy about pushing that cart was something that felt very different. And you can't help but walk in a grocery store these days and feel like you're in some kind of post-apocalyptic movie, because we're all lined up, we're all wearing masks. You've got someone on the loudspeaker coming on and reminding us about social distancing and all that kind of stuff, that the experience of some of these things is nowhere near what it was like before, and that's going to have a lasting impact. Now, on the idea of opening the economy, we've been doing some tracking on this in a number of ways. A few weeks ago, we asked people, which side of the go faster or go sort of slower you were on. You can see 83% of Canadians say go slow and err on the side of caution when it comes to reopening the economy. A minority, 17%, say it's time to open it up again. I think that's affected by people's concern about a second wave and the risk to them still. And so despite wanting to get back and getting life back to normal, there's still a real fear that there's another wave of this coming. So that's the big picture. And there's lots, if you've got other questions, I'm happy to answer at the end of this. But one of the things that Angela and her team and I really wanted to explore that we did unique for this webinar or briefing was a look at how impressions of the trucking sector in particular may have been affected by this pandemic. And you can't help but see, and you all are far more in this world than I am, but even as a relative outsider to the trucking and logistics sector, you've probably got more positive attention than you've ever had in a really long time. And the results bear that out. So when we ask people across the country, what's your impression of trucking companies, right? That's how we're sort of framing it. You can see that these are really positive numbers, 54% positive, 32% neutral. Only 5% of Canadians say they have a negative view of trucking companies right now. And when we compare that to other sectors that we tested, you can see it's, in line with all those frontline kind of professions that have been continuing to do the work that they do through this difficult time, have all had really good numbers, right? Grocery stores, hospitals, farmers, trucking companies now have a higher net rating than food manufacturers, construction companies, or airlines. And it wasn't long ago that I wouldn't have seen these kinds of positive numbers. So the overall picture is quite positive. But even more important to reflect on is 29% of Canadians say that their impression of trucking companies has improved over the last few months. So this is people actually, admitting and reporting a sense that I feel better about the work that trucking companies are doing. I have more sympathy. I empathize. I understand what they're going through, and I understand their importance to the economy. And so, unlike at any period that I have at least been involved in doing public opinion research, do I see a real moment for the sector to stand up and say, we are important, we are critical and essential to the health of the economy, to the health of individuals who need the products that we ship every single day. And the results show that people are seeing it. The other thing that we tested was a perception around how essential these different, professions or sectors are to your life. And not surprising, almost everybody says grocery stores, hospitals, farmers, and food manufacturers are essential. But 72%, a huge number, say the trucking companies are essential, right? Almost 3 times as many who say that about construction companies, airlines, or we use mining companies as another example. And so this notion that people have been forced to, I think, reflect on, and we do a lot of work with food manufacturers, for example, who for years have struggled to get the due that they deserve in terms of the role they play in people's lives and the economy as the largest manufacturing sector in Canada. I think trucking is also in my travels around the country with Angela, meeting many of you, I felt the same kind of frustration. Well, now we've got proof that, at least for the time being, there's a new appreciation for the role that you play in people's lives. So that's the good news, and I think some positive. The work we've done with trucking HR has also looked at perceptions around the job itself. And we use long haul trucker as a base, but it's not the only job, obviously, in the sector, but one that is often used for us as a guidepost to understand how people feel. And so what we did here is we tested people's perceptions, like we did in the survey we did of millennials about a year and a half ago, looking at perceptions around it and whether these perceptions have changed or not. So this is all Canadians, not just young Canadians. I'll get to them in a moment. But what we find is that, the things that we saw before, most people think that the jobs are well paid, that there's lots of them available, that they're generally safe, right? But mixed views on, is training affordable? Most people think it is, but there's a sizable number who think training is expensive. Inflexible work, especially in a world where more and more jobs will likely be more flexible. An uncertain future around autonomous vehicles, around the health of the economy, and this respected by others, which I think is really important. And we were doing some work, and we'll continue to do work with CTA and Trucking HR as a partner in that, in the image and reputation campaign to try to inspire people to join the sector. One of the things we've often focused on is this perception that driving a truck or working in the trucking and logistics sector wasn't respected. People didn't see it as a noble calling, right? And so one of the things we've learned, actually, that when we compare, in particular, 18 to 35-year-olds in the country, and we go back, and it's the only group I can do this comparison because we didn't survey older Canadians earlier, I can compare the same questions to the survey we did in December 2018, and we see a few sizable shifts. Perceptions around safety has increased, I think largely because we did the survey soon after the Humboldt tragedy that I think brought safety questions and trucking into people's focus. But since then, I think increased understanding around safety, respected by others among young people, up 10 percentage points. That's a real improvement in that. Still room to grow, but nonetheless good. And a growing understanding that maybe there is some work-life balance in this kind of job, that I have some control over, particularly around long-haul trucking, of when I drive, what I drive, that there's some understanding. Other metrics haven't really changed. Lots of jobs down a little bit, well-paid still there, predictable future, unchanged since December. And so this says to me two things. One is the overall image of your sector has improved. You've had this moment of focus and attention and good vibes and people cheering, those in the sector on. Lots of stories about, the lack of rest stops and making it difficult, and the risk that your drivers and others are putting themselves in to get these goods across the country and from the US or other parts of North America. And at the same time, improved perceptions around the job, but still, I think, hurdles. And so my conclusion is really, there's still some work to be done. Now, a few more points. One of the things Trucking HR I know is working really hard on and is focused on is the affordability that it takes to become a truck driver, right? And the cost that it takes to get training, and the lack of subsidies or available funding that's available to help people get into the sector. Well, what we found is that, most Canadians agree that the government of Canada should provide funding to make it more affordable for people to become truck drivers. It's a little lower among young Canadians. I think this is reflective, this is a good numbers as a starting point, but it's also reflective of generally a lack of understanding that most people have about what it actually costs to become a truck driver. I think there's this perception, this mixed view. Some understand that, training is expensive, but others believe it's fairly easy and it doesn't take a lot of training to get that. So clarifying that and continuing to communicate that across the sector and to the public, I think, will be important. But there's no doubt, and this is a great number, 85% of Canadians agree that I think we need a strong trucking sector for Canada's economy to be healthy over the long term. 72% of younger Canadians agree with that, also a good number. And so this confirms what the other numbers earlier showed, is at a moment of crisis, at a moment when people early on in this crisis were deeply concerned about the food supply, around access to the products, household goods that they needed, right? Whether that's toilet paper or canned goods or flour or yeast, whatever the people were worried that they wouldn't have access to. The fact that the sector delivered, not to use that pun too widely, is a real positive, I think, that you can build on going forward. And it doesn't mean, I think, that the work is done and that Canadians are going to wake up, because when we ask them still, would you consider a job in the trucking sector? There's still some trepidation, a little bit higher than we had seen in the past among younger Canadians, but still a very small number who say, I definitely would consider doing this. And so we've always said from the very beginning, my colleagues at Spark Advocacy who are working on the campaign with CTA, that this is a long-term project, that building a platform that gets people to, particularly young people, to reconsider a career or consider a career in the sector requires them to think highly of it, requires them to believe that other people think highly of it, and that they feel that it fits well with the kind of lifestyle and needs that they have. I think today, ironically, despite how challenging the economy is going to be for many of you and for the sector overall in the short term, that you are almost better placed today to deal with what will still be a long-term labor shortage going forward. And my recommendation is to continue to build on that and to continue to put pressure and remind Canadians and parents and young people that your sector's there and that a job in the sector is worthwhile. So to wrap up then, what should you bet on? I've been telling everybody that I've been doing these kinds of briefing with, there's still two unknowns, is how long and how deep the economic deterioration will be. And the big X factor is whether and when a vaccine emerges. I think from a consumer demand side of the equation, in terms of what people are going to be doing, what consumption is going to be like, obviously a constraint on many households' budgets will, I think, prevent people from spending on household goods, on cars, on big ticket items, household appliances, things like that for the short term, as they try to figure out what the long-term impact is going to be. But I also think from other types of behavior, new interests, new habits may replace old ones. And so that will have less effect, I think, on your sector, because that's less probably about goods, and more about services. But I think the two are kind of linked. And as I already mentioned, I think this is really positive. Canadians are feeling really good about the sector. They've seen the role that you play. They most view it as essential to the economy and to their lives. But when it comes to the long-term labor shortage that we know will still be there, even after this kind of difficult period is over, work still needs to be done to get people to truly understand what it's like to work in the sector and the range of jobs and opportunities that are there. So if you don't get a chance to chat or ask a question in the next 15 minutes, here's my contact info. Please reach out. Happy to connect. But Angela, I will stop and hand things back to you to moderate our Q&A.
Sure, we do have a question, David. So it's regarding the perception. So what is the reason for the better perception? Is it truckers delivering essential goods? Or really just, I think he's asking for some reasons why that is.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't go into that depth in the survey to know why, but if I reflect on the last few weeks, I think first, you've been in the news far more than I think you've been in a while as a sector, right? Even CBC, I watch CBC News every morning, and they've got this little ad that talks about a food service worker talking to a truck driver and thanking them for the work that they're doing. I think there's a real appreciation for the way that the sector's delivered for Canadians in many ways, and I think a lot of the negatives that are often associated with truck driving, accidents, safety questions, were really not there. And so you got this moment where people could actually empathize. You have to, I always remind folks that, a lot of people don't know someone who drives a truck or has never even imagine being behind the wheel of one or knows what it's like to be in that sector. I do think for a moment there, we were able to empathize in the same way we empathized with frontline, health professionals, or we empathized with grocery clerks who were put in kind of harm's way, and we saw the plastic go up. Those were all moments where people could reflect, and I think so. It's part about delivering, and it's also, I think, just recognizing that those drivers that I always now notice, some of them wearing masks all the time, are every day putting themselves at risk, and they're not doing it for me, but it's benefiting me as well as them in terms of their job.
David, thanks. And I think that answers the question, Abdul. And he's also asking about a bit on methodology. So when were the surveys conducted and how many people were polled?
Yeah, so our surveys typically, if you looked at all those data points, we typically survey at least 2,000 Canadians. The survey that we did with Trucking HR on the trucking had 1,800 Canadians surveyed, representative of the population by region, age, gender, official language, and education. And the survey was done, we launched it Thursday and we finished it, I think we finished it Monday. So it's really fresh data in terms of impressions.
Yeah. Thanks, David. There's another question, Sean, how do we inform moms and dads and other influencers about the importance of these careers for young people? I think I can maybe speak to that one a bit. The Canadian Trucking Alliance and other partners are embarking on a national industry image campaign. So we're using the research that David did with what those barriers were, and we're working to address those perceptions at a national level. So that's one thing we're doing. There are also provincial trucking associations across the country that are also embarking on initiatives to address those perceptual issues. It remains a key area of focus for the industry moving forward. So there are no other questions coming up in the chat group. So unless there's other questions, oh, I think I see one here, sorry. Sorry, I have to click, I can't see it all, David. So it requires political, social, and economic willpower to maintain our current isolation. Which of those three types of willpower do you see weakening and breaking first? Good question.
It is a good question. It's something we're watching. I mean, we're in a really strange moment for a number of reasons, right? And I think everyone's perception on this is going to be different. So if you're somebody who is quite vulnerable to this virus, you're older, you've got a chronic illness, you're going to be much more hesitant to get out and get back to life as you know it, because you really do worry about getting the virus. If you're somebody who is like my age, who maybe doesn't feel so vulnerable to it, but has older members of my household, or not my household, my family, who I don't want to infect, I'm also going to be thoughtful of it. I think I don't see evidence yet of a deep impatience among people to get back to it. I actually think, strangely, we've found some comfort. Most people who haven't been completely disrupted economically by what's going on in the day-to-day. And so I don't have empirical evidence yet, but it's one of the theories I'm going to be testing. Is we've been living this life now for 10 weeks. I think going back is going to feel a little bit uncomfortable to some. And so the willpower to keep distancing actually is lessened over time. It's no longer willpower, it just becomes normal. And then what's not normal is waking up every day at 6:30 and taking a shower right away maybe, and going back to the office or going to the workplace. That's going to not be normal for a lot of people. And so I think we're about to enter a phase where we're going to see different factors affecting people's response. I think that the other factor in all of this is, at least until the end of August, we've got a lot of Canadians who are dependent on government aid for their income, and that as temporarily help them, but the incentive to get back to work for some may not be as great. And I know a lot of sectors, we work with the produce sector, they're having a hard time getting people to come back to pick fruit because I can make, the equivalent of just over minimum wage from government aid. So it's going to put some new pressure on what incentives you need to provide to get your workforce back engaged again. So I do think it's going to be slightly different, but it's something I'm watching closely, and it's the right question to ask, and we should be watching it as these things evolve.
Thanks, David. Another question we have is what do you think the biggest challenge is for our industry? What biggest challenge are we facing going forward?
Well, you guys all know your business better than me. So in terms of the deep business, I don't know. I do think that, Angela, you've convinced me on our tour together that the labor shortage remains, it's going to be for a lot of sectors, not just yours, a real challenge. That, and I don't know what the impact of this is going to have on retirements, but I've seen in some sectors, like I work with the Air Canada pilots, for example, and there's some indication that a lot of senior pilots are going to retire early as a result of this. And they already had a pilot shortage. And so, yes, right now there's no real need for a lot of pilots because most planes are grounded. But at some point, the demand will come back. And so for me, the long term, I look at the business, there's going to be ways to mitigate, a declining sort of workforce in terms of automation and some, the rise of autonomous vehicles perhaps in the future. But in my mind, I think the acute short-term challenge will be economic growth and getting people to consume again. Once we're through that, I think the biggest challenge for the sector remains labor shortages and talent and getting, whether it's new Canadians, women, young Canadians engaged in the sector. And I know, Angela, your team has been working very hard on all three of those. That to me still is the long-term primary challenge of sectors like trucking. We see it in mining. I was on a call this morning, and I think Anita's on here with the electricity sector. We see it in forestry, right across the board. If you're a skilled trade or a profession that's not, in the so-called really high in demand sectors, that to me is still going to be the long term. So the work that CTA is doing, I think, is still really important.
Yeah, I agree with that, David. Thank you. We also have another question here. Do you have an idea on how trucking will be impacted between Canada and the US?
I don't know for sure about any restrictions on movement. I do think, I can only speak to the hesitation that Canadians are expressing around the US itself. We did a survey for Music Canada on live music, comfort going to live music. And when we throw in going to a concert in the US, the level of I don't want to do that is quite high. So I think Canadians are watching really closely what's going on in the US. It hasn't yet spilled over into concerns around, for example, food coming from the US or the idea that, but I do think that if I were to ask Canadians, and I haven't done it, whether they support keeping the border shut to non-essential travel, most Canadians, I think, would say yes to that. There's a deep worry about the risk the US is going to play for us in the long term if they can't really control the spread of the virus. And that might carry over into the logistics and trucking sector as we think about people's willingness to drive to the States, their willingness to accept people who've been there to come back. There's going to be some complications around it, and understanding that perception and communicating clearly, both to drivers and to consumers, about how you as employers are protecting them and keeping them safe is going to be paramount over the next months, because I think this is going to be a longer term conversation.
Thanks, David. Another question. You mentioned the impression of trucking companies has gone up 29% in the past few months. What was the previous level?
Well, that question actually was, has your impression of trucking gone up? We're asking people. So I don't have a baseline of what the impression was before, but based on the survey we did of millennials, which is a subset of the population, I'm confident to say the impression has improved, and it's improved probably at least by 10 to 15 points as a result of all of this. But I use that indicator of when I ask people, has your impression improved of the sector? The only 3 sectors of those that we tested where at least 10% of Canadians said their impressions improved were trucking, grocery, and hospitals. And hospitals were already held in really high regard to begin with. So to me, that's a clear indicator that coming out of this, people have a new appreciation for the sector, and I'm confident that you're viewed in much higher regard than you were, 10 or 11 weeks ago.
Thanks, David. Another question. You've mentioned that the perception is that this will end with a vaccine. Do you have any insights on what might be some of the permanent perceptual changes Canadians will have even after a vaccine is found?
There's so many questions that I have that I can't yet confirm because we don't really know what people are going to do on the other end, right? Like things as simple as, will we shake people's hands as much as we did after, right? Is the loss of physical contact and physical kind of connection something that, not because we don't feel comfortable shaking people's hands, but if you don't do something long enough, you eventually stop doing it, right? Like that's why I describe these new habits. I think in terms of public policy, the role of government, I do suspect we're going to see Canadians feeling that our country should be more self-sufficient, particularly on essential goods like medical equipment, food. I think we've had a lesson in how integrated our supply chains are, which you guys are a critical part of, but also how fragile those supply chains can be if one piece of it breaks apart. I think particularly of food. So I do think that we're going to have a discussion, and we're already seeing it in I think our political realm about making Canada more self-sufficient. Globalization will probably continue to recede, and more impetus to kind of do Canada first, US first, Europe first kind of policy making. On the consumer side, we do see an increase in the number of people who say they want to buy local, they want to support local producers, they want to support, it's hard to say whether that will convert into actual behavior. People always say those kinds of things, but I do think that for many people, they've lived through 10 weeks where they weren't buying a lot of stuff. They weren't consuming as much as they used to. And I do wonder whether that's going to continue, where people kind of, we ask a question on our surveys, like, do you think you're going to live a simpler life after all of this? And like 85% of Canadians say yes. Again, whether they actually do that is another thing, but I do think that we may enter a period of time where our consumption goes down, the type of things that we do becomes much more, simple. We explore nature, we go for hikes, so I do think there will be lasting impacts. I also think, for sure, one of the things that will change is how we work, particularly for office-based workplaces where flexibility is an option. I think you're going to find, if there's any one sector that is kind of heading into a very rough, scary patch, it's commercial real estate, right? If I owned a big building full of offices and my leases are coming up, both with the financial pressure that businesses are facing and the now option of having, part of your your workplace rotating in and out of home, and it's going to probably be required for the next few months. That to me is something that we're going to see shift. So again, we can't predict the future with certainty, but I feel that that's likely going to be something that goes forward.
David, do we have time for one more quick question before we wrap up? Just one saying, do you have any data that would suggest the upswing in the assessment of long-term trucking during COVID is also found in rail?
Good question. We work with the Railway Association, and I think we're going to do stuff. I haven't asked the direct question, but I suspect yes to some extent, but also no. I think trucking has gotten far more attention. The stories about truck drivers, the stories about, closed facilities, rest stops, that's something that I didn't hear as much about rail. I think the appreciation for rail was much in people's spotlights during the blockades that happened. If you remember, it seems like so long ago, right before this crisis. And so rail had its moment when we had the blockades and goods couldn't get through. to understanding how important rail was. I think this crisis was much more focused on trucking than it was for rail. But over the course of 2020 so far, we've had two big events in Canada in which has brought attention to our logistics and transportation sector in really ways that have, I think, created new appreciation for how important they are to our individual lives and the broader economy.
Thank you, David. Thanks for the presentation as well. There's a lot of comments in the chat group of people saying excellent presentation, great data. So I think your insights have been greatly appreciated. So for those on the call, this was recorded. We will be uploading information to our website. So we will let everyone know when that becomes